Hey guys, it's been a little bit. I'm guessing it's probably been close to a month since I've been back here. And what's going on, Dave? What's up? Well, a couple things. One is I have a son graduating from high school in 3 weeks or so, and that makes you busy. I have one kid. This is the only time I'm going through this, and I think if you get to this stage and things are going well, it really can be reason to celebrate. In his case, it is. The guy's just doing great, and he's come so far. But there's that. But there's another thing. It's occurred to me, and I think I may be 1 week beyond this, that I've been doing this for a year. Been here a year. And I guess the obvious question is, what have you learned, Dave? What is the lesson to be learned from this experience? Like a headmaster, at Phillips Andover Academy, or your vice principal at your local high school. Well, tell me, Dave, what have you learned now? And I would venture to say that just 6 weeks ago, or maybe 2 months ago, but in that neighborhood, I probably would have been really fishing for an answer. And just recently, a bunch of things have sort of come together. So I have a much better idea about all of this. When I first got into this a year back, I think in the first video, one of the things I was talking about, I've been interested in this whole thing for a while, is the nature of platforms, the nature of social media. Whether you would even include this, I guess we would. YouTube's kind of slightly different that way, but what are the rules? How does it work? I admit that I've been, to a degree, not just lost on it, but I'm not a natural for necessarily understanding all that. I'm not hugely social. So understanding, what people react to that way, I can understand that in an artistic sense. But when it comes to other forms and this sort of stuff, it means, I think, understanding the culture, and the culture is always moving, and that doesn't get easier as you get older. It gets tougher as you get older. So I've had to do a lot of drilling down, and it just bothered me that I sort of wasn't getting it. I felt like I should get it. Why am I? And I don't claim to have the answer, that I've got it all figured out, or I have, but I know more than I did before. One of the things, it's not that I've learned enormous new things, but I've learned some of the assumptions I went in with turn out to be more right than I could have known. And I guess that's part of it, is that by doing it, you have to, you're thrown into the ocean, and you just have no way to navigate. And so you have an inkling that something is true, but how much of an effect did that really have? You have no way of measuring anything. And the only way you can even start to get that idea is by getting any kind of results. Now, results have not been easy to achieve. They're not easy to achieve, I know, on YouTube. And so a lot of the things you're told, there's an awful lot of people out there who are going to tell you how it's supposed to be done, or they'll sell you a course. There's a ton of that. I don't want to say it's all wrong, but again, it's a matter of emphasis. And sometimes you think, oh, you must really do. And a lot of that seems to be not true. And it makes you also, the entire experience makes you, I think, clarifies your own ideas about what's important in the first place and what you're doing here. So there's a lot of angles at this. Let me start with, I think the assumption going in is, if you're somebody doing what I'm doing, which is essentially commentary, you're not gonna you're not going to find an enormous audience as a person my age into music that's not even mainstream music. You're not necessarily going to, find an enormous crowd out there. You're just not. If you're 24 and you're attractive and you're selling cosmetics, right? I mean, I understand why the person who blows up on Instagram blows up, right? But if you're going into it coming from my angle, those expectations would be silly, right? That's not going to necessarily happen. And so what is it? What is it that you can do? Well, I'm not unhappy with what I'm doing because it doesn't strike me as being really any different from what you're getting from podcasts. Not podcasts with interviews, but a lot of podcasts sometimes are single person, that you're getting from a blogger, to the degree that still exists, that you're getting from there are some sites here, there are some channels here where there are folks who will just speak to you. Even if it's old time talk radio, a lot of what you get on cable news, which are shows that feature people just talking to you. I think more of I think makes more sense to think of it in terms of the almost a talk radio analogy. I think is a better analogy, because I think people would listen to that and while they were doing something else, or while they were doing something, and just, again, not because they agreed with everything the person said, or they were necessarily being told something they didn't already know, but they were having an experience, they were communing to a degree with another human being through those experiences. And I think that's what any of these things are probably doing. It's not that you agree with me, it's that hearing what I have to say, you say, well, I agree with, well, I don't know about that. It helps you to clarify your own thoughts. I think that's what any of that kind of programming, I'm going to use programming because I don't like content. I don't like the idea of people deciding what you're doing, giving you a definition, saying you're in this box. Don't go for that one. I don't want to go for that one. But we're doing, however you want to express it, the programming that you're doing, I think to some level that's what this is. It's why people read a column. People who read columnists, they're having this experience where they're reading that in their head, and they get it. So I think that's kind of what this does. So I don't expect to necessarily have a huge audience. Now, while I've been doing this, I've also been very active. I got very active, I guess, probably at the end of last summer. I got off Twitter because what Elon's done to it, essentially destroyed it, intentionally destroyed it. Okay, that's wonderful. And I think Twitter at its best was bordering on being almost a public utility, and probably could have gone that way. Because it was where all the news happened, it was where everything happened. And Jack couldn't, I think so many times he had an opportunity to make it into something, and Jack is a very strange guy who can't figure out from one minute to the next what it is he wants to do, or what things should be, or maybe we shouldn't be. I've never met a more rudderless, I've never met him, but I've never encountered perhaps in that sphere, in the world that we look out at it, someone as rudderless as Jack. Jack is just, and Dorsey's brilliant, but he's a weird guy, and he cannot make up his mind. So they got bought out, and it's been ruined, and I think we are not the better for it. So I jumped over to Threads, right, which is the meta version. And interesting what's going on there, in that Threads isn't really sure it wants to be a Twitter clone. The only reason people went there is because it was a Twitter clone. But now they don't want to be that, because they don't want to push politics, because which is, by not pushing politics, you're making an overt political act, right? You're putting your fingers on the scale, and some voices won't be heard. That is politics. You are amazing that they can claim to not see that or get that. Anyway, I got on there, and that went okay. But I've had a few experiences where one of my threads has had a degree of virility, unlike anything here, where it suddenly gets picked up and it starts going. And a couple times, my favorite example, I got reposted by Jerry Ryan. Jerry Ryan is the actress probably best known for being Seven of Nine in one of the Star Trek franchises. Extraordinary looking woman and good actress, and I like Jerry Ryan. Maybe she has some terrible ghost in her past, but from what I can tell, she seems like a pretty cool human. But anyway, Jerry Ryan started liking my posts and reposting me. And she's got, hundreds of thousands of followers. So suddenly, because of that, a whole bunch of people are now seeing your stuff that otherwise wouldn't see your stuff. That's great. And it's been interesting. And I said, thanks to Jerry. I first didn't think it was her. I was like, not the Jerry Ryan? So I had one of those, was like, that's cool. And turns out seems to be very nice. And apparently, occasionally, on multiple occasions, what I'm saying apparently is a bright, good thing, and she wants to spread that to the world. And it doesn't, what I find interesting about this is, people say, if you just do good work, it'll get out there and people will see it. And I don't think that's true, because the evidence seems to be, a lot of this is, if it's succinct and it's quick and you make your point and then you have a better chance. People don't want to get into things that are too deep. Why something like I'm doing here is, programmed to not be successful, right? But I don't care, because I think there's something more important going on. Okay, but I'm watching some of those things take off, and when they do, why is it? We're in this, attention economy, and I don't think that's good. Even when it's been successful for me and gone, I think it's being successful for all the wrong reasons. So I'm a little careful about, if whatever you say, the loudest person in the room gets the attention and that gets the most visibility. If the person who says the most craziest thing is the only things that we see, then it's a free-for-all to who can be the most nuts. Sound like our politics much? Right? That's what's getting rewarded. And the regular populace seems to want to expect that. I think that's, I'm trying to think of I think the term I've come up with it is noise culture. But there's essentially is no value. It's absolutely vapid. And yet that's what's, right? And we've been doing this for, as long as people have been watching, Kardashians, basically, right? The more vapid it is, the better it does. The more dumbed down it is, the better it does. And that's like anything, it's got to break eventually too. And I think it will, and I think there are signs that it may already be starting to do so. And so, what side do you want to be on that, right? If you're making stuff, you're talking to people, years down the road, when they're looking back at this period of time and shaking their heads in disgust, do you want to be part of that? That was, I'll say anything just to get somebody's attention. Is that what you want to do? No. And would you rather do something you feel good about? And again, I think it's a long-term investment thing. I think if in the long term you just keep making material and that material has some value or has some thought process behind it, has some intelligence, then I think making that long-term investment is something that you can look in the mirror about, feel at least okay about and it'll go where it will go. Okay, so I've experienced a little bit of that, and so I get that a lot of this is, again, it's not our game. We think it's our game, and it's we're at the mercy of algorithms and platforms owned by billionaires, and don't think we have any, we have this control. A great deal of this is just the luck of the draw, and somebody decides. And once it starts to get a little visible, it starts to take off on its own. It has nothing to do with you. You didn't do anything. And I've noticed that with my own that have done well. Give you another one. The last video I did here. Guys, I'm going to ask you to pause for the cause. I hate to do this, but I got to. So check that out, guys. The first time there's been an edit in the history of this channel. We're really doing good now. So where I was at was the last time I put up a video here, I got the best reaction I ever got. And I got the best reaction, I think, because it had a clickbaity title, right? So I fell for that. I'm not saying, you should not want people to see your stuff, or you shouldn't do things that help people to see your stuff. And it's interesting because significantly more views, okay? And I at the outset of that video, I remember saying it was a provocative title and that I would get there, okay? But you're gonna have to go with me, because I'm just not gonna just jump into it. And if any of this is any good, or you like it, you think anything I'm doing here is okay, then you like the way I am, and you're fine with that, right? Which means you're not gonna get, those who need their answers in 8 seconds, you're not gonna get it from me. That's not what I'm doing here. I'm not playing that. I'm not doing that. And so I actually saw comments. I'm like, oh my. And one of the comments was like, what is this guy talking about? It's about 8 minutes in. He hasn't talked about jazz yet. Could be. You might have to wait 20. Because I talked about Sagan, and I talked about then the personal view idea by James Burke. And then I talked about a little bit about Burke. And because that was leading us to the era of time, and the era of time led me to my argument about jazz. So there was a, there was a throughput there that got you, but I wasn't just going to throw out, because I don't, you know what, I don't like that kind of talk. I don't like people glibly throwing out some idea that whatever's the latest idea is the best idea ever because it came out 5 minutes ago, and I'm just going to throw, there's a lot of people just throwing stuff against the wall, and you know what, I don't think it's short-term gain, and I don't think it's the way. I think eventually it's a house of cards, and I think it will collapse in on itself. Doesn't mean I'm going to have a tremendous amount of success, but that showed me, it was very, very straightforward that I went from, I'm noticing I have things on my clothing here. I gotta dress better. Although it is a Jean-Luc Ponty t-shirt. It's a Cosmic Messenger Jean-Luc Ponty t-shirt. I don't know if you know the record. Wow, what a great record. Every now and then I put that on. I think it ages pretty well. Jean-Luc Ponty, what a fascinating cat. Anyway, so suddenly I was getting more attention just because my title was, So I'm gonna wrestle. I have a feeling I'm gonna wrestle with that. But I wasn't being clickbaity in that I didn't put up the title and then never went there, because I did go there. So, I'm gonna do it in my own time, and some people aren't gonna dig it. I'm also getting inured to that it's obvious that a lot of people aren't making good faith arguments. And frankly, there's a lesson that people have said for years online, and they're right about. I think that, don't feed the trolls and all that. And I'm not sure they're always trolls. I just think there are a lot of unhappy folks out there who I've mentioned this before. The internet might be one of the worst rolled out things in the history of rolled out things. The minute we allowed everyone to not use their name, you'll notice on all my socials, you'll see my name. People go, "Oh, you would never use your name?" You would. Yeah, I think you should. And I think you have sort of a moral, ethical responsibility to stand by what you say. We always did. Well, we don't now because we can hide behind something. So to do the morally reprehensible thing, that's the way you should go. I mean, come on. You should stand by it. I really think you should. And so there's a bunch of others. This is really a housekeeping episode. I admit to that. But so the first part is the nature. What have we learned? What I've learned is don't buy into. I don't think going viral is necessarily anything necessarily to be proud of. You may have had some material that got a little, but once it takes off, it really has very little, I think, to do with you. And I think it can be done, where before I didn't think it could. It depends on the platform. It depends on what they're pushing. And I think a lot of it just doesn't have much to do with you. But I think if you're just a provocateur, I think that it takes you so far and may get you started, but I don't think it's the route to go down. You could say some provocative things, assuming that you could back that up, you mean it, and you could discuss it in some depth, and you're not just saying something crazy. You're saying something that you really mean, and you have some kind of, you can stand behind it. You could prove it. There's more you could say about it. You weren't you're not just out there trying to garner attention. So, and there's so much of that, and I think people increasingly are reacting against it, and that's good. All right, so what have I learned? I've learned you can go and become more popular. And do you want to? And at what price? I was reminded recently, when I mentioned earlier about reminding me of like talk radio and stuff like that. The state of journalism is a disaster, and it's hard for me to watch. And I was reminded of, and because all things are cyclical and all things come back, I wonder if in the years ahead there will be a serious pushback against this version of news, which is no news. We actually don't get much in the way of news. Cable news is all political talk and all opinion political talk almost all the time. So there's not a lot of here is the news. And I remember back, and I think it's so counterintuitive, and yet on some level, it's almost time for it again. I remember going way back when I was a kid and remembering the old McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour. She later became the new, now is still the NewsHour. But in its earliest phase, when was, Jim Lehrer and Rob McNeil, it had to be the blandest television show ever. There was like, the background was taupe, and they were in suits, and they were expressionless, and there were no graphics. There was nothing. Sat at a desk, and they read news in a monotone, pretty much in a monotone. And there was something about it that was very pure. There was no news music. It wasn't a theatrical event there was no sensationalism. And you trusted it more. It didn't need to be a show. You're trying to find out what was true. And you were more likely to believe it if it wasn't a show. That is lost on people. So that may never come back. But man, I long for it. People would not understand that today. Anyway, so what have I learned? That's what I've learned. I've learned that you can do this stuff, even a person like myself, to some degree. But how far do you want to go? And I don't want to. I don't want production values, and I want it to be one camera. I don't want it to be just me burning without edits. I want the real, and I think for me it's the only way to go. It's what I want to do, and it'll go or it won't go. And I don't really care that much because I'm not here about dig me. Turns out I'm not. A couple other things before I go. There were, well, this is a little tougher. There were a couple deaths. A couple deaths happened. And one was, they're both interesting. One was, I'll start with David Sanborn. David Sanborn passed away, the alto sax player. And he's an interesting guy in that a lot of people, I think, want to make David Sanborn be this, maybe years ago, but probably wanted him to be some kind of jazz representative or something like that. And, when you think about all the, he played on Stevie Wonder, right? Tuesday Heartbreak. He was James Taylor, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, Young Americans, David Bowie. A lot of music for a whole generation of people that they listen to their whole lives. David Sanborn's on that. But that's not as a jazz musician. I don't think David Sanborn conceived of himself that way. I think he always thought of himself as a popular musician. He could play some jazz and was in jazz groups, and this nature of the instrument, right, that he would do some of that. But he was always a fusion guy and the smooth jazz guy. And again, a lot of people hate that stuff, and I understand. I understand where they're coming from, but at the same time, people made a career out of it. Sanborn was so popular. I remember when I was in college at Berkeley in the 80s, there was a guy there with long hair, very good-looking kid who sounded a lot exactly like Dave Sanborn. It was obviously intentional, that metallic, nothing but blues licks, and he was going for the Sanborn sound, and he could do it. And so he had a little bit of buzz around him at school. Now, while that's true, and he was a good player, there were sax players who were better players. And so there was a sense among people talking about him because he garnered some conversation because it was so obvious sort of what he was sounding like. That, good Lord, to spend your whole to build yourself musically to literally be a clone of something seemed tacky. It seemed in bad taste. The joke was on us. That guy went on to have a huge career. Record companies wanted a guy who they could sell just like Dave Sanborn, who was a good-looking kid. He had a very good career. I don't know. I think he's still playing. Did very, very well. And not a bad guy. I'm not knocking this person. Trust me. I haven't spoken to him in years. But it, kind of shouldn't have gone that way, right? And it was a real wake-up call to a lot of us about just how shallow the music business was. It was all about anything they could sell or whatever buck they could make at any point. It was never about, the only people protecting the music were the musicians, because those forces, commercial forces, weren't out to help, weren't the slightest bit interested in music. So there was a lesson to be learned there. And for Sanborn himself, the guy had a great career, but I think he never, I'll give him some credit for this. A lot of guys who played fusion were given a hard time because they couldn't play straight ahead jazz or weren't playing straight ahead jazz. Dave Sanborn never found, not that I'm aware of. Someone could remind me that he did a straight ahead record. He played bird tunes, but I'm not aware of that. To his credit, he stuck to what it was that he did. He was unashamed. He didn't think of it. He thought of himself always, I think, much more out of a blues background and as a popular musician than necessarily as a jazz musician. And you know, a lot of the fusion guys, especially the smooth jazz guys, really get taken to task for being cop-outs and for going for any sound to get, to cash in, trying to do crossover stuff. They could play jazz, but they decide not to play jazz. They intentionally dumb down their music. And, it's not a completely unfair accusation, because some of that was clearly happening. But there are also guys, and I think Sanborn was one of them, who never was, he was going to go play straight ahead. He wasn't interested in doing that. He was doing exactly what he was interested in doing. He actually fit that scene. And again, you can hate that kind of music, but people had incredible careers doing it. And I think he was an extraordinary player. He did what he did extremely well, and he was completely recognizable. You would never not know it was David Sanborn. You would always know. You could always tell that sound. And it was, he could be very lyrical. He played ballads great, but mostly played original material. Wasn't, and the very thing that people knocked him for, looking back at it, is probably something positive. He doesn't have to go play Moment's Notice or something, to prove that, what is he? He's got to prove to the jazz academia, the jazz police have to be, he never did that. And you know what? Good for him. He just never bowed to that pressure. To thine own self be true. In his case, I think he actually was. It's the reasons why you do things, right? It's not what he did. This is who he really was. He wasn't some guy going, I'm going to cash in on that crossover money. No, he was always there in the first place. So, I was sorry to hear him pass away. By all indications, a very nice man. And was I a huge fan? Do I listen to tons of David Sanborn? No, but I had some of his stuff before I became a heavyweight jazzer. I was listening to Dave Sanborn. Did some cool stuff. Always had a good band. Yeah. Anyway, the other one is this one's gonna get tricky. Steve Albini died. Okay. Now, why is this tricky? This is tricky for me because I met Steve Albini in, I believe, late 90s. I met Albini because I knew somebody who was connected to that whole scene and wanted me to go down into Lower Manhattan, Lower East Side, somewhere to see his band Shellac. And I was up on a balcony looking down at the band. I was right above the drummer, and there was the band. And they did their thing. And I got to talk to Albini for a while afterwards. Just because I was introduced, there were a bunch of people. And look, I've seen enough videos of Steve Albini in later years to know that he was a very bright, thoughtful, passionate person. And he had very specific ideas about what he liked. And as a recording engineer, he could get that sound. Okay? So I don't think he was some dope or some, but you've probably heard the tales too that Albini could be a very difficult guy. And Albini, it was, when I met him, he was in your face with his anger and with his passion. And he was a creep. And it was needing to dominate a conversation. I don't remember having that much to say to him. I think I picked up early, okay, this guy, just let him do his thing. I don't need to, because I wasn't there to have an argument with him. But it was fascinating, the amount of ego and almost a need for control and to control the conversation and very specific ideas about what everything should be. I don't knock that per se, but the ego, the anger, to say it was a bit much, okay, it wasn't. So I wasn't terribly impressed, and I think he needed to be taken very seriously. He was sure he was a very important person. Just ask him; he'd be glad to tell you. I mean, it was that sort of thing. And then I had heard his band. That's not my thing. And it's obvious that a guy like Steve Albini and myself wouldn't agree on much of anything. And this led me to think about that aspect of it. Some of our musical styles are simply mutually exclusive. It's one of those things nobody wants to talk about. We're all part of one musical family. And yes, and we're really not. If you're a communist and you're a capitalist, you can't be both. You can understand both intellectually, but you can't be both because they are mutually exclusive ideas. If you are one, by definition, you cannot be the other. And this comes up with a lot of musical camps. He famously produced the Pixies, and I'm trying to think some of the other groups. Obviously the Nirvana thing, but in general, the stuff that he produced, I thought was awful. I'd never listened to it. I think it's junk. How dare you? You can't think that. Okay, I know. For some folks. Look, Steve Albini hated Steely Dan. I love Steely Dan. We're never going to see eye to eye. I don't agree with virtually anything that Steve Albini thinks is the great music. I don't. Like, he wanted that very direct, he wanted to capture that live thing. I think that stuff's great. I really do. Reminds me of some good jazz recording. Don't have a problem with that. And again, I don't think he's necessarily a bad guy or a dope. But I met him, and on the occasion I met him, I wasn't terribly impressed. He was a creep, and he acted like a creep. And I'm certainly not the first person to say that. He was but that doesn't mean he wasn't bright, and doesn't mean that he didn't have something to say and he didn't have something to give. And just because I don't like the styles of stuff he was into doesn't mean I'm right either. So I'm totally fine with that. But I think, and I'm sure he'd be totally fine with that. And I think he was probably, with other styles that he disliked, he would rail against them. But okay, but you're allowed to. But I think we do have to understand that there are these different camps, and we're not pulling in the same direction. We're not saying the same things. We don't have the same values. That happens within different segments of jazz. It happens within different segments of classical music. It happens all across popular music. And, trying to appease a particular cognoscenti, obviously I don't think is necessarily makes sense from the person making the music, from the artist's point of view. You just have to make your own stuff, and people are going to decide what they think it's going to be, and okay, for them, what they think it's going to be. But it's very possible that you can make some stuff that you might be very pleased with and you like, and some people may like. But guess what? It's guaranteed that there'll be a crowd that can't stand it, which is right back to the same experience that we have online. There are people who, there are folks who are going to love what you do, and there are folks who, by the very nature of what you're trying to do, they despise it and despise you. And you can't win. So don't try. Do you. Do you. So if it sounds like I you speaking ill of the dead. Well, sometimes I don't buy into platitudes, and we all say what wonderful person someone was when they weren't a wonderful person. I bumped into Roy Hargrove a few times, and he was a creep. And I think he was one of the most extraordinarily talented musicians I've ever run across. Saw him live. I think I would just walked into Smalls. I actually played with him once, but I walked into Smalls, and he was at the piano, and then he was playing his horn, and he could do anything. But he didn't know me, but he saw me with a horn on my back, and he knew I was a trumpet player. So I became the enemy, and he was like going at me, and I was like, all I did was walk in the room. What? And he had a guy of his talent. He didn't have to worry about me. What was he doing? I just think the guy had significant amount of problems. I also will tell you this. I don't think, people say he was one of the great jazz musicians. As great a player as he was, being Freddie Hubbard in the 90s or playing like that doesn't equal what Freddie Hubbard did in the 60s. He was a guy doing an impression. Almost perfect, extraordinary player. Please understand where I'm coming from. But there was nothing new happening. I thought he was part of that, the beginning of what, that we're going to do jazz, but it's going to be an impression. All right, kids. I could go on. I have more stuff to talk about. But I'll leave you with, speaking ill of the dead. That's great, huh? What a bad guy you are, Dave. But what have I learned? I think I've learned a few things. I think I've learned a little bit about how this ecosystem works. And I'm not sure I don't think we want to play that game. I don't think we want to do it. I don't think we want to play the game as they're describing it, they're making it. We don't have to. We could do it on our own terms. And I think long term we'll be better off. So I will continue shouting into the wind. And I'm okay with that. I imagine I will, but I think, like I said before, I think going into this, doing what I'm doing, coming from my direction, it's going to be years and years, if ever. But it'll take a long time for anyone to pick up on what I'm doing, sitting there going, that Dave Painter guy's a bright guy, and, we should hear more of what he's going to say. It's going to take a long time, if that ever happens. It's just too, I'm not 24 and selling cosmetics. So, but you know what? I'm cool with it. All right. So that's my housekeeping. That's my one time around the sun. We'll see where we are next year. We've gotten around the sun again. There'll be lots to talk about by then, but I have more stuff in the meantime. I have more internet talk, actually. I think I've learned there are a few other things I've learned, but we will save that for another episode. I don't know that this will get a provocative title, and I doubt that it will do nearly as well as the last one. And you know what? That's just fine. I hope you're good wherever you are in the world. If any of this interests you, if I'm on to anything, feel free, get in touch. Let me know what you think. And, like and subscribe, right? But you can. That's nice. And obviously, I'd rather it be successful than it not be successful. So I'm good with that. Yeah, please. In the meantime, I'm going to go practice and go work on some new music. See you guys soon.